Stories of an aircraft builder. Projects of the years 2005 and 2006. At the beginning of 2005, the commissioned work for Peter Jackson began. But the relationship with Oliver Wolf was also still ongoing, although it was steadily deteriorating as agreed payments failed to materialize and things got increasingly out of hand, but more on that later. The second half of 2005 was still packed with preparations. In addition, the previous space was limited, so more had to be created somehow. I made an agreement with my landlord that a simple hall measuring 10 by 20 meters could be built on his premises at my expense. While this hall was being built, I was able to enlarge my small office by removing a wall. I spent most of my time preparing and building the wing ribs for the Fokker D.VII as the Engels E.III, as well as those of the 3 Fokker E.IIIs, which were the Engels E.IV, to be built. Everything was put together in the metal shop, and the construction of the fuselages for the E.IIIs also began. If you are wondering where the documents for the replicas came from, I would like to put you off until one of the next episodes of this series, in which I will go into the archive and its structure and contents separately. At that time, a man named Hartmut Weber appeared in my workshop. He was a fellow aviator who also dreamed of building his own airplane. However, he had an RV4 in mind as a kid. Hartmut was also hard hit by life, was separated from his wife and had 2 children whom he looked after as best as he could. He also happened to live in Remstraße, where my company was based. As I always worked longer hours than normal, he often came over in the evenings and we talked. We also talked about the possibilities of building the RV4 for him. As I was neither interested in the RV4 nor in building another people's kit, especially full metal airplanes, I asked him one evening whether a Fokker airplane wouldn't be an alternative for him. The conversation went back and forth a bit, and after exploring the possibilities I made a phone call to New Zealand and asked if a Fokker C.I would be of interest to Peter Jackson. He wasn't averse, and so we took on the C.I as a side project. I have to mention that I already had my future museum in mind back then, as I described it in episode 25, The Time Machine. My idea needed airplanes, of course, and so I agreed with Peter Jackson that I would also build an airplane for myself at the same time as I did the job for him. At my own expense, of course. The additional time required was justifiable because whether I cut a pipe twice or 3 times doesn't make much difference. And so, for example, 3 reproductions of the Fokker E.III were built as Engels E.IV, 2 of them for Peter Jackson, 1 for me and my plant museum. As far as the C.I was concerned, it wasn't a priority, not even for Peter Jackson. Hartmut was supposed to invest his time and produce the parts for the 3 C.Is as far as he could, 1 for him, 1 for me and my museum, and 1 for Peter Jackson. The cost expenses for the 2 airplanes, his and mine, were to be covered by myself, while the other one was covered by Peter Jackson, of course. And so little by little, wing ribs of the E.III, the D.VII and the C.I were made in the wood workshop. Later, a 3rd person joined in. That was Shirley Girard of Mudflap Aviation, but one thing at a time. At that time, Peter Jackson started to rebuild the Benz 4 engine in his company TVAL, that is the Vintage Aviator Limited in New Zealand. Such engines powered large reconnaissance aircraft such as the Rumpler C.IV, which he wanted to build in his company. He therefore asked me if I would be able to make drawings for the replica of this machine from which he could build. I said that it was quite possible if he had the time. I had the complete parts list, the construction description and various original factory drawings of the aircraft in the archive already. One original was in the German museum It's not really a Rumpler C.IV, but that's not the point now. And Marco Sommerau owned the remains of a wreck in Belgium at the time. Peter Jackson sent me to measure and photograph the plane in the German museum, and he sent me to Belgium also to measure the wreckage of Marco Sommerau. Many photographs and many dimension sketches were made, which were then used to produce new construction drawings. Hartmut also turned out to be an excellent technical draftsman, and so we set up another drawing board in my now enlarged office and began to create new drawings for the Rumpler C.IV, together after work, which we sent to New Zealand as soon as they were finished, where the construction of 4 examples began, one of which was also intended for my museum, but patience. So, during the day I worked on the D.VII, the E.III, and helped Alexandra with the pedal planes, and after Hartmut's evening we both worked on the wing ribs of the C.I and the drawings for the Rumpler C.IV. That was a lot of productive hours. Every hour was logged for Peter Jackson and everything was recorded in detail and writing. I was in daily contact with his offices under Jean DeMarco and Don McCracken in Wellington, and we clarified everything that needed to be done and how, so that nothing stood in the way of the aircraft certification in New Zealand. At the end of each month, a detailed report full of photos and timetables listed followed. Of course, the same was also done for the aircraft that were built for me at the same time, as they were registered as project with the German LBA, and I was lucky to do so, as turned out later. Of course, the whole thing was accompanied by the Oskar-Ursinus-Vereinigung and supervised by Jürgen Fächer as an expert and approved by Hartmut Sammet as a construction inspector. These were huge and beautiful projects. When the assembly hall was finally finished, I was able to expand accordingly, which made the work much easier. This meant that the premises in Schondorf at Remstraße 22 now had a proper office, a drawing room, a metal workshop, a wood workshop in the basement, and a relatively large assembly hall. Alongside this, there was also further research and the writing of articles. The current projects were of course presented in World War I Aero again. In the well-known magazine Flight Journal I was able to publish an article in my constant struggle for the truth in 2006 too, which I would like to read to you briefly at the end of this part. The article was published in the section Airdrop, under the heading "Many drawings of Fokker designs from that period exist, and none show Platz's signature as the draftsman or as the one who approved it. The same is true for Fokker himself." Sub-headline was "More D.VII news." In reference to your article in the October 2003 issue of Flying the D.VII, Fokker had a staff of engineers, and Reinhold Platz was not among them. Many drawings of Fokker designs from that period exist, and none show Platz's signature as the draftsman nor as the one who approved it. The same, by the way, is true for Fokker himself. I have no evidence of how much Fokker actually contributed to the technical developments of his company, but I'm sure that he had at least some influence. It is certain, though, that several engineers worked on these planes. Platz is a very controversial figure, but his reputation was raised to heights he never had at the Fokker factory by the work of Alfred Richard Wales' book Fokker, The Creative Years. I would also refer those interested in this topic to Peter Gross and his article about Reinhold Platz and his meaning for the company of Fokker. Gross puts things beautifully right. Apart from this, my own research revealed that Platz might not have been a designer at all. I have copies of the citizen records of the town of Schwerin for the years between 1914 and 1919. It was a German practice to include the profession of the person along with the address and some other information in these official public records, which were tax important. Reinhold Platz is listed there as a Flugzeugmonteur or aircraft mechanic, not as a designer or even chief designer for the Fokker company. German records are quite correct in this respect. When this is compared with the other avians, it makes me really doubt that Platz was the designer of these planes. What is definite is that Platz learned his welding technique through the Frenchman Fouché, who invented the new acetylene torch. Platz was also the first in Germany, at least as far as I know, who managed to weld aluminium using oxyacetylene. His skills were the reason that welding was introduced at Fokker, and he established an evaluation bureau at Fokker that made simple but effective strength tests with materials and welded joints. He was at least a consultant for the engineers insofar as he judged whether a designed junction of tubes could actually be realized without major problems in distortion, shrinkage and structural rigidity. But that was all. He was obviously no designer and wasn't responsible for the shape of the aircraft at all. The chief designer at Fokker at the time of the development of the D.VII was Moser. This is revealed in a postcard that dates from this time, carrying his signature along with the note Chief Designer, Fokker Flugzeugwerke GmbH. Apart from this, we should not forget that the D.VII wasn't the sudden brainchild of one person, but a development from a line of aircraft. One could say the D.VII was a D.VI modified to carry the D.III engine, and that it became a success was more or less by chance. Don't forget, there were other inline types that were built by Fokker as rotary-powered aircraft, as well as rotary-powered prototypes that were converted to inline engines. This was done so that the company would have both options open and could see what happened. Most of these designs are unknown and weren't successful. In reference to the statement made that the Fokker D.VII at Munich is the only surviving original Fokker D.VII, the Munich Fokker D.VII is a very strange piece that is very different from the wartime D.VIIs built by Fokker. That aircraft is XD-20, see photograph, that flew with the Dutch Air Service in the 1920s. It is not even a Fokker-built machine and was built after the war. As you can see, the aircraft was quite different in the outline shape. When it was flown in those days, it was later modified to resemble the outline of a war-built Fokker D.VII. The structural features of this aircraft are quite different from wartime Fokker-built aircraft. The only Fokker-built survivor is held by the National Aviation Museum in Canada. The only Albatros-built survivor is in the Brom County Museum, and the only Ostdeutsche Albatroswerke OAW built survivor is preserved in France. All of these are not the same, they differ in quite a few points, depending on the version and manufacturer, but these are all original World War I survivors. There are other originals, but I do not have my files at hand now. Signed, Achim Engels, Fokker Team Schorndorf.